Good evening. I'm Paul Fredette.
And I'm Karen Fredette.
Together, Karen and I have been ministering to hermits and to religious solitaries throughout the world since 1997 through Ravensbread Ministries, right here from our home in the mountains of western North Carolina. About 6 months ago, we responded to a very gracious invitation from Brother Sean Bradley to participate with the interfaith Franciscan community by presenting weekly broadcasts on the Doves for Peace channel of the live stream network. And we feel, both of us, very, very privileged to have been given this opportunity to share prayer and reflection with you over these last 6 months. Prior to beginning our work with hermits and solitaries throughout the world, Karen spent more than 30 years
More than 30 years.
as a poor Clare nun at the monastery of Santa Clara in Canton, Ohio. And just last week, we both started to share with you the fruits of her research on the life and the times of the foundress of her order, Clare of Assisi, which was first published in 1984 and reprinted last year for the 800th anniversary of the founding of the Poor Clares, as the second of the Franciscan order has come to be known. The title of the book is Clare, Her Light and Her Song, and it continues to be available on the Ravensbread website. So if you're interested in procuring it for yourself, you can obtain it there, and we'll send you an autographed copy from here. Chiara di Favaroni, we'll get a picture here of Clare to remind you again. This is one of her best known and one of the earliest, isn't it, Karen?
It appears
portraits?
to be early because of the style of habit in which she is portrayed. It's a fresco that is in the Basilica of Santa Chiara in Assisi. And until maybe 40, 50 years ago, it wasn't even available to the public at large. Only the sisters, the poor Clares who lived there, saw this.
Well, Chiara di Favaroni, Clare of Assisi as she's known to history, was a very courageous, fascinating, and inspiring woman who lived in an equally fascinating and tumultuous time, the 13th century, in north-central Italy, or it wasn't Italy then, but it was on the Italian peninsula. It was the time of the High Middle Ages, a time of a lot of change. And for several centuries, during the 9th, 10th, 11th, and 12th centuries, there'd been sort of Christianity, and the Christian church had acted as a sort of leaven in both the societies of the West and in the East, in the empire, and pretty much just distilling and kind of fermenting that whole experience. And it came to a culmination at the beginning of the 13th century. It just sort of really burst forth.
Flowered, maybe.
And yeah, sort of like in full bloom. All of those slowly growing movements and facets of society had been growing and moving along very quietly and slowly until there was just this real burst, this blooming, this blossoming of, of beauty and art, of war, brutality, of spirituality, and of commerce. Um, it was a real profusion of sight and sound and color and movement. It was very much an age of turmoil and change. And in some very profound ways, not that we can offer any kind of one-to-one correspondences, but there are many, many resemblances to the kind of change and the kind of cultural and societal tumult that we've been experiencing in the late 20th and 21st century. In 1200, when Clare was just 6 years old, and by the way, Francis Bernardoni, later known to history as Francis of Assisi, was 18 years old. So if any of you are familiar with the Franco Zeffirelli rendition of the Francis and Clare story in Brother Sun, Sister Moon, you'll see that there was a much greater age disparity than was portrayed in that rather idyllic and poetic lyric portrayal, but there was quite a bit of difference in the ages between Clare and Francis. The small but significant city of Assisi, and here we offer you a picture of the temple of Minerva that had been preserved from Roman times and had been converted by then. But this was part of Assisi, as Assisi was in the days of Francis and Clare. Clare knew this particular site in Assisi.
It was exciting to go there and to find it still there.
And you, whoops, kind of go way, way too fast there. Some of the beauty and the architectural beauty of some of the works can be seen in this enormous outside fresco on, actually this is a mosaic, not a fresco, on the exterior of one of the churches in Assisi. I'm going to try to move this around just a little bit here so that we can see this a little bit better. This is sort of a panorama shot of the city of Assisi itself. And you can see that it takes over this whole hill on Mount, whoops, gotta keep moving this thing around here. It takes over this whole hill part of Mount Subasio. And here today, in this, on the left-hand side of your screen, this edifice is the great Basilica of San Francesco that obviously was not there during the days of Francis and Clare. But really, if you subtract that, they probably could have stood in this same field over here and looked and seen pretty much what we can see today. Isn't that right, Karen?
It is, depending on whether they look before or after the destruction of the fortress of the Rocca Maggiore.
Right, right. Now, Assisi sits pretty much in the middle, not exactly in the middle, but of an area in the Italian peninsula known as Umbria. And at this point in history, it found itself in a situation, a scene of just really amazing complexity. For one thing, Umbria is the only political or ethnic, if you want, entity, very, very old, existing at the same time as an entity, as an area, Umbria, as when the Etruscans were there. But it's the only such area in what we now know today as Italy that has no coastline and is completely landlocked by other provinces like Tuscany and the Marches and Spoleto. So when Francis and when Clare especially arrive on the scene here in Assisi, it is very much an age with many colorful figures on the stage of history, all of them very strong, very ambitious, very arrogant, and in many cases, very violent. Just 2 years prior to the beginning of the 13th century, Pope Innocent III took the chair of Peter and became, well, I lost it again. Shame on me.
All right, honey.
Innocent III took the chair of Peter and immediately set about reestablishing and redefining the papal states in their entirety, reclaiming lost territory and everything else. He wanted the papal states really intact. And he stopped at very little in terms of what he did to make sure that his territories would not be encroached upon, and really set about during his papacy in making himself the temporal ruler of all Europe as well as the spiritual leader of all Europe, in the way that he related to the sovereigns of the various emerging nation states and city-states and duchies that were extant at the time. Now, in all of these political machinations, he had to also relate to Frederick II, the Holy Roman Emperor in Germany, which Germany itself did not exist at the time, but Frederick II himself was a very colorful person, referred to and known even in his own lifetime as Stupor Mundi, the wonder of the world. This was not a man known for his reticence or his humility. The continent of Europe at this time was changing very, very much. And although the nation states that we know today as England, France, Spain, Germany, Italy, did not yet exist in a way that we would recognize them today, they were slowly emerging and forging through a number of changing alliances. There was so much war on the European continent during this time. It was the age of knighthood in flower. It was the age of chivalry. We're talking about all kinds of nobility of minor ranks as well as kings and emperors. We're talking about knights, and we're talking about of course, in every age, the proverbial peasant and serf. But what is really taking hold now and what is really new is this emerging merchant and artisan class that turns into a force, is becoming a force to be reckoned with, not only economically but socially as well.
Yes.
Of course, you can imagine that with all of the wars and all of the conflicts going on, taxation is a very big factor in everybody's life. Increasing taxes, repeated taxes, and more taxes. And part of what is fueling this is that all the wars are disrupting the trade routes. And as long as the trade routes, commerce is disrupted, there'll always be shortages. And so the need for increased taxation. Italy, as we know it, does not exist yet, but here I go again, flying through this. Italy doesn't exist, but as you can, let's see if we can,
see yet.
as we cannot see yet because I don't have this on, but if we can move this over, we can see that down here is in the red area towards the boot, towards the toe, and the heel and the toe of the Italian boot is the Kingdom of Sicily. What you see marked in the blue are the Papal States. And up in this area, just north, in this area right here, is where actually all this light green area belongs to the Roman Empire. And I believe this is the kingdom of, or the Duchy of Spoleto in the dark green over here. So there are, many, many opportunities for alliances to be made and to fall apart, and for innumerable conflicts to characterize the way of life at this time. This is a day when being a Venetian or being a Roman or being a Florentian is far more important than being an Italian. In fact, for the most part, people don't really have a sense of being Italian. And the Pope has to resort, as you can see just looking at the size of the Papal States here, resting, with the Kingdom of Sicily to the south and the Duchy of Spoleto and the Roman Empire to his immediate north and east, he's constantly forging alliances with foreign powers and foreign rulers to help him to maintain his independence and his powers, and trying to keep the independent temporal possessions of the church secure.
Due to this geographical fragmentation of the Italian peninsula, the people were intensely involved in political life, but it was in their own small city-states, which were usually included in wars with all their neighbors on a regular basis. You could almost compare it to how the rival towns' football teams fight now against one another. Well, in those days, it was actual fighting on horseback. It was the knights and the foot soldiers that were recruited from the farms, and the peasants came into this and had their farms marched over back and forth, so that there was manifold miseries that resulted from this almost continual warfare, as well as the plagues and famines that inevitably follow in its wake. In spite of this, they built not only impressive civilizations, but also great cathedrals. For this period ushered in the early Renaissance, laying the groundwork for some of the greatest artistic achievements that our world has ever seen.
Let's see, here's one of those cathedrals. But we're going to talk about those later, aren't we? We're going to go
We're
back
going to talk about Gothic architecture now,
okay,
which was developing from the earlier Romanesque style. In France, Notre Dame in Paris was begun in 1163. Francis was born 1182, Clare born 1194, and the Notre Dame was only completed in 1345. So
right.
It took a century and a half but it was being built in the new Gothic style, as was the Cathedral of Chartres, which was being built literally during Clare's lifetime, begun in the year of her birth, 1194, and finished in 1250, only 3 years before her death. But on the Italian peninsula, French Gothic was subtly transformed and given a more airy elegance, which expressed, I think, the southern temperament of the people. These churches were filled with what the best artists of the period could give them, and these were highly gifted men and women, producing music, frescoes, sculptures, all under the patronage of the church and inspired by the vibrant and profound spirituality of the period. Artists like Giotto and Cimabue, Raphael and Michelangelo were working during Clare and Francis' lifetime. Many of them were contributing to the grand Basilica of San Francesco, which started after Francis' death in 1226. So we can say that the 13th century was characterized by life in capital letters. North central Italy, Umbria, Tuscany, where Clare and Francis were born, was composed of dozens of these small city-states and communes, and they chafed under the dominion of the German overlords. But trade was flourishing, bringing riches from the Orient that the Crusaders had discovered and introduced into Europe. Francis' father, Pietro Bernardone, was a member of the new rising merchant class that was profiting from the trade routes that were being opened and crisscrossing Europe. Assisi itself was a tempestuous town and hated the German domination. In 1198, the young men of the city took advantage of the temporary lack of an emperor in Germany, and they stormed the Rocca Maggiore, which was the fortress above the city of Assisi that flaunted the emperor's flag. They were successful and tore down that fortress, which was never rebuilt. And then they turned on their own nobility within the city, who fled for their lives, and that included Clare's family, the Arferduccio clan. And they took refuge in the rival city of Perugia, just 12 miles across the valley, but where they had family members and other people who supported them. So, at the age of 4, Clare knew the terrors of civil strife at first hand. At the same time, Francis, at 18 or 20, was getting his first taste of war, and because it was successful, he found it exhilarating. Bitter conflict raged for 6 years. It was only in 1204 that a truce was declared, and Clare's family was able to return to their ravaged home on the square by the Cathedral of San Rufino in Assisi. In the upper levels of the city, where all of the aristocratic families lived, all of the town houses of the nobility were designed with these tall towers, not for beauty, but for defense, literally. They would take refuge there, and they could fight off their own townspeople. But it was these hated towers which Francis and his comrades tore down, but then, as part of the truce, were required to rebuild as when the treaty was forced upon them. The younger men took the stones from the towers of the nobility and began to erect a wall about their town. And perhaps this is where Francis acquired the art of masonry, which he would put to good use later on.
Well, in 1202, it didn't really last very long, because by 1202, Perugia and its people were assisting the exiled nobles of Assisi to challenge this coalition, this commune of self-government of Assisi itself. And really, by 1204, only 2 years later, the nobles of Assisi were back. The Arferduccios and their ilk were all coming back to Assisi, and their tower homes were being restored, as Karen said, by the very young men who had pulled down their homes to begin with. And they had to pay huge fines as well. And this Perugian victory only aggravated the long-standing feud between these two cities that actually are only 12 miles apart across the Umbrian Valley. And as Karen said, although it was happened in a more deadly way, it was a lot like the football teams of two rival towns, with a lot more lethal consequences to the rivalry. In Clare's family herself, she had a neighbor who lived like right next door to the Favaroni Palazzo. His name was Pietro di Damiano, and he records that in Clare's family there were at least 7 knights, all of them noble and all of them very powerful. So you can imagine that in that Offerduccio Palazzo, that the comings of goings of all the knights and their retainers, the squires, the pages, all of the accoutrements of chivalry and war and knighthood, this was a highly charged atmosphere even for the young girls to be living in. It was, on the one hand, very frightening, but on the other hand, very exhilarating. Here are all these handsome young men,
Clomping
in and out and going off to war and burnishing their armor and, sharpening their swords and all of the other weapons that they used. And at this very same time, if you can imagine all the residual feelings and emotions about the recent conflict, and you add to that in 1202, the same year that the commune in Assisi starts to fall apart and the nobles start their return, Pope Innocent III decides to assemble, proclaim, launch, if you want, the 4th Crusade. So now he's recruiting all these young knights from England, what is today England, from the areas of France, Germany, Spain, Venice, the Netherlands, all of these places. He's recruiting knights to go and recover the Holy Land again. For the stated purpose now, the stated purpose of launching the crusade, as they say, when we talk about politicians talking on message, was that it was for the recovery of the shrines in the Holy Land. The unstated purpose, really, of this was to reopen the trade routes between the East and the West. Now, the Pope had an even deeper agenda that not too many people, at least at the time, were really very much aware of, except those who were in the know, and that was his goal of annexing Jerusalem and making it a Latin Rite diocese attached to Rome. This never happened because the Crusaders figured out that the task of reopening the trade routes and reestablishing commerce, and this is partly due to the pressure that was being applied by the newly emerging merchant class and artisans, that it was far easier to get this accomplished by negotiating with the Saracen than it was by exterminating them. So this is really what happened in the 4th Crusade. A lot of the negotiations with the Saracens happened, and as a consequence, the trade routes reopened, and all of the valuable trade and commodities became available again as the merchant class and the artisan class was growing. So in a way, the nobility and the knights that were the fruit of the nobility and the aristocracy were actually undermining their own social class because they were contributing to the rise of the merchant class and the artisan class. We've said a little bit about the expansion of commerce and what was happening also at this time because of the expansion of commerce, trade, and was that the people, much of the population was moving from the countryside into the cities and towns. So the towns and cities are growing. And now you have this whole new phenomenon of a lot of public buildings, municipal fortifications that have to be done, like the construction of this great wall around Assisi that Francis was part of while Clare and her family were exiled in Perugia. You have it's just a whole new way of living for many, many people. Well, you can imagine that the whole idea of the newness of the towns and the cities, they didn't have the sanitation, they didn't have all of the infrastructure that makes our living in towns and cities not only tolerable, but actually for many people who choose to do that, a very livable situation. In the time of Clare and Francis, it was not. People's lives were very short. Many people died of plague and sickness and infections of all kinds. So life expectancy was not really big. One of the things that was also happening at the time with the influx of people into the towns was that coinage was gradually replacing bartering for goods and services. And as the coinage of many of these various duchies, principalities, city-states of all kinds gave need for the rise of great banking houses in all of the cities like Venice and Florence and Rome and Naples, and all of these places had large banking. So the banking industry is now really taking off. In this atmosphere, the attitude of is it your time yet? Or?
Yeah, I think, because we were talking about the many changes that were taking place in the lives of the people. We have to remember that the Italian peninsula looked physically very different then than it does now, partly because most of the countryside and the mountain slopes were still thickly wooded. They hadn't been deforested like they are today.
Right.
As a result, wolves, bears, and wild boars roamed freely, and during the winter months, they even invaded the towns and cities when food grew scarce. So those walls served more than one purpose besides military defense. Also, roaming about the land were human predators, political exiles, of which there were many, unemployed soldiers when there wasn't a convenient war going on, and the usual assortment of bandits and murderers, which made travel extremely hazardous. Most people only dared to move about in large groups that were protected by armed guards. Life in the city was different than what we might have thought, and I'd love to share with you this description of Rome in the 13th century, which really shows how rough and tumble urban life was. Rome, the capital of Christendom, the most famous city in Europe, was only a den of robber barons. Miserable mobs lived in squalor among the ruins of the Eternal City. Rome was still surrounded by the 3rd century walls built by Emperor Aurelian. Inside those walls, however, there were huge open spaces where goats and cattle grazed. The massive ruins of the ancient splendors were constantly growing smaller because their stones were being used by the Roman barons to build their towers and fortresses. By the 13th century, there were said to be 500 towers in the city of Rome, each a monument to the pride and the pugnacity of the noble families who lived there. The barons who fought each other for power within the city owned huge estates and many castles in the surrounding countryside. It was a brutal, barbarous, and arrogant time in Rome, and it rang daily with the clash of arms, and the streets were spattered with the blood of friends and enemies. The people of Rome, who considered themselves the worthy heirs of the Patricians of Antiquity, they were famous for their villainous rapacity, their dishonesty, and their addiction to violent rioting. They lived by providing food and shelter to the pilgrims who came there, but at extortionate rates, and they were despised by everyone else as the scum of the earth.
Nice.
Yeah, a lovely place to live. Assisi, a smaller city still tied to a rural economy, probably didn't match the degradation of Rome itself, but still, it was a rugged place to live. When Francis made his first trek to Rome, that would have been about the summer of 1205, when he was still wretchedly trying to find out what God wanted of him. He probably didn't find the conditions in Rome, as I've just described them, so shocking as we might, but we do know that his ideals suffered a severe blow. He was upset, they said, by what he thought were the niggardly contributions thrown into the tomb of St. Peter. So he, in his lordly way, took his whole purse of gold coins and threw the entire thing in, which did nothing more than to reduce him to having to beg for food. And he found out that when he tried joining the beggars on the city steps, that he was rudely turned away. He wasn't welcome because he wasn't one of them and hadn't earned the right to use any of their space. And I'd love to share with you something that was written by a priest who visited Rome in the 13th century. And this is what he thought of the city. How can you enjoy safety in this city, where all the citizens and the clergy are at daily strife for and against both opponents? The heat is insufferable, the water is foul, the food is coarse and bad, the air is so heavy it can be grasped with both hands and is filled with swarms of mosquitoes. The ground is alive with scorpions, and the people are dirty and odious, wicked and fierce. The whole of Rome itself is undermined by the catacombs, which are filled with snakes, and from which there came a poisonous air, which, caused people to faint. Only the hardy could survive in the physical as well as the spiritual jolts of a pilgrimage to the Holy City. Francis did survive, but his faith in the church was rather shaken. He became more detached from appearances, which had once entranced him, and began looking for Christ elsewhere, a search that culminated in his kissing of a leper, in whom he saw, for the first time, the image of his Lord. And in doing so, he was set free from his bondage to exterior appearances.
Very powerful experience for him. Not all the Christians of that era, though, had the same inner vigor of Francis's faith vision. And there were many for whom their attitude toward the church was either they scorned the secular involvements, which were innumerable, of the church, or they despised the power-seeking and vice of the clergy and the hierarchy. They deplored the ostentation and there were many who just really did not have any kind of positive regard for the organization, the formal structure of the church itself. So what would be the response? Well, some of them actually did what we talked about in the last few months. They fled to hermitages. Either the hermitages of the Syrian and the Egyptian desert, or the hermitages that they began to find in the forests of Italy, on the mountainsides, in the caves, in the forests of France, Germany, what is today France and Germany and Italy. Or they began slowly, but beginnings, we don't have anything near what is the Reformation today, or what was the Reformation in the 16th century, but here we are at the beginning of the 13th century, and evangelical groups are beginning to emerge, resisting the corruption and the sense of fallenness that the greater church seems to exude. And so in places like Lombardy, you have the Humiliati. In places like Lyon, in what is today France, you have the Waldensians. Further to the south, you have the Albigensians are beginning there. And you have the community, the Beguines as well. The dangerous thing here is that with these evangelical groups, many very quickly became labeled heretics. So it became a very chancy thing to join some of these evangelical groups, and in many places they weren't safe. This is also the time where we're only a few years away from the beginnings of the Holy Inquisition, and to root out heretics. And so it is one response to the negative reaction to what's going on in the church, but it's not necessarily the safest response. And Francis and Clare were clearly in the tradition of this evangelical, lay evangelical movement. And so this was one of the risks, especially at a time when even throughout the common folk of Christianity, there still persisted a lot of superstition, a lot of what they regarded in those days as semi-pagan practices and ideologies. And so heresy was not something that you really wanted to fool with or take a chance with. They took a very dim view. It's one thing to call somebody a heretic today in our secular age, but not in the 13th century. Because we have to remember that secularism, the whole concept of secular life, really did not exist. That did not come into being until the age of rationalism, the beginnings. This is an age that knows no real secularity. They may know profanity, but they don't know secularity. The papacy, the sacraments, the realities of heaven and hell, the nearness of the angels and the demons and all the saints, very, very much a part. The belief and expectancy of miracles, very, very much a part of ordinary life, not only among the peasants and the serfs, but among the merchant class, among the knights and the nobility, the aristocracy, and definitely among the high leadership like the emperors and the kings, who are seen to be the divinely appointed, the anointed of God in their position. This is the time of the divine right of kings. But also, too, we have to say that urban life was not just war and politics, regularly punctuated by religious feasts. But unlike the individualized character of the 21st century, it's very, very intensely a social affair, the life that Clare was born into. Privacy, for instance, which is very much valued and shared in our lives today, was unknown and undesired.
Mm-hmm.
Homes, certainly of the lower classes, but even of the upper class, were cramped, and they were crowded with a lot of people. And people started to spend more and more time as the cities grew and the great squares and palazzos began to emerge within the city, within the safety and the security of the surrounding walls. More and more people started spending time out there. Here they were out in these wonderful palazzos, seeing other people, meeting their friends, being seen by others, their friends, an opportunity also to insult your enemies in a tactful way. It was a place where they could get the local news, yes. And not only the local news, but the regional news and even world news. Wasn't exactly network news like we have it now, but it was where information could be obtained and could be shared. And on a more personal level, it was an opportunity for courtship for the young people. And even though in those days, social mores being what they were, this was a highly controlled and chaperoned situation, not so much so that we couldn't pass secret signs and love notes among the young people. It was one of those things where it was where everybody knew everybody and knew what everybody was doing too. So everybody's affairs, everybody's business. This was a way of life in these small city-states, in these emerging towns. And they were not just, they were actually rather colorful affairs. We're going to show you this slide over here, yes, which is,
and I wanted to,
and Karen wants to comment on this.
Yeah,
I just want to say that it was, in the context of this kind of city life, that Pietro Bernardoni, Francis's father, who was a cloth merchant, would make his trips out of the city to obtain all these fine fabrics, these damasks and silks and all these other things, and bring them back and make them available. And so you have this riot of textures and colors. And Karen, why don't you go ahead and speak to this?
Well, I did want to. I was, people were wearing, those who could afford it, were wearing very sumptuous garments. Francis himself was known to wear what, quote from his first biographer, to dress in fine and flowing garments. And no doubt they were made from the fabrics from his own father's shop. He was a walking advertisement, we might say, of the family wares. At that time, there were sumptuary laws which were trying to regulate the clothing of the middle classes, so they didn't dress better than their betters, as we can say. Even Rome got involved in it. There was a priest in Padua who decided to issue a law which forbid the women's trains on their garments to be longer than 1.5 yards, because he felt, of course, that this was it was wasteful to spend this much on fabric, but actually they had other things in mind as well. But the men were as colorful as the women, wearing scarlet tunics, fur robes, abundance of gold chains and rings, and often, especially in Italy, a flowing overgarment that was called a guanocca. This was frequently lined with bright silks in the summer and fur in the winter, and decorated with gold embroidery. So you can imagine what Sunday morning Mass in the Cathedral of San Rufino, where the wealthy of Assisi attended, must have been like. The men and women were in rose, bright blue, scarlet, green, crimson. They would gather in the piazza before San Rufino, which was incidentally at the front door of Clare's family home. They were wearing buttons of gold and silver. There's a description of the times which I love, and it's about the ladies of Faenza, a city to the north of Assisi, but probably it was not much different in Assisi. It's said that the ladies wore on their heads a chaplet of gold and silver thread. Their necks were all bare, without any ornamentation, to the point where the bodice begins. The vest itself was girt about the flanks with a golden girdle, often adorned with gems. Some had the bodice adorned with gold, and the rest of the dress was purple or crimson silk, with open sleeves hanging halfway down the leg and then reversed back over the shoulders, as were frequently the sleeves of the camisette, which were open, allowing bare arms to be seen. And these arms were artificially whitened and adorned with chains and bracelets of gold, which reminds me of the colorful tattoos on many arms that we see today. So it was a very colorful time, and it was colorful in the period, colorful in the life, and colorful in fact itself.
Well, it was in this very vocal and lively milieu where the wars raged and the heretics ranted, and probably a lot of thoughtful people just about despaired. God was quietly at work preparing two souls, Francis and Clare, who would rise to a stature that would surpass even that of the majestic cathedrals that were being raised all over Europe. They loved deeply every nuance and shade of the world they were growing up in. They were affected by all that occurred, and they were great-hearted enough, both of them, to embrace it with Christ's transforming love, a love that would waken it to the kingdom that was already growing in this boisterous midst.
Today, we have looked at the world of Clare and Francis and how they had to have been influenced by their times. It was a century not unlike our own times in terms of great change, vitality, and religious ferment. Clare was a woman who apparently loved her times and all that surged around her. It was colorful, both literally and figuratively. So it is hardly surprising that when she was writing to a very dear friend of hers, Agnes of Prague, whom she never met, but with whom she felt very close, she was writing about the spiritual life, and she quoted from the Song of Songs. And we would like to share that song with you, for she quoted it often. The song that we'll share with you is written by a daughter of Clare, Briege O'Hare.
Make us a beautiful daughter of God and spouse of the King. Look at your face reflected in His, and let your heart sing. And cover yourself with the flowers, and cover yourself with the rose, and cover yourself with the glorious light of Christ the Lord. Make us a beautiful daughter of God and spouse of the King. Look at your face reflected in His, and let your heart sing. What marvelous humility! What astonishing poverty! The King of the angels, the Lord of God, the child should be. Make us a beautiful daughter of God and spouse of the King. Look at your face reflected in His, and let your heart sing. So run and do not delay. His sweetness lightens the way. His kiss is the happiest kiss of all. His love is your life. And cover yourself with the flowers, and cover yourself with the rose, and cover yourself with the glorious light of Christ your Lord, of Christ your Lord.
Before we close our time this evening, we'd like to just suggest that for your own meditation and your reflection, spend a little bit of time looking at your own culture, how the culture you live in affects you, affects your day. Think of the major things that are affecting you, influencing your life, educationally, politically, economically, religiously. Make a list, a short list, just for yourself, to just look at all of the things that have been major influences in forming the person you are and in affecting your response to life and the way that you live, what your life looks like. Just like we tried to describe, Karen and I tried to describe this evening, the context in which Clare de Favaroni grew up, and the context which somehow led her, and you might say either in response to or in reaction to that context, she made her decisions and gave her gift to God. It's a journey all of us make. Some days we make it more deliberately, more intentionally, more consciously. Other days we just seem to go with the flow, so to speak, without dwelling or reflecting too much on what are the factors that are influencing our attitudes, our perceptions, and our response to the divine, our response to the ground of being.
Yes.
We suggest that you take some time during this coming week and reflect on some of those factors. And when we return next week, we'll begin to look a little bit more closely at Claire's own life, right,
That's right.
Karen? And we'll look at her family background, and her infancy. And now we want to leave you once again this evening by asking for God's blessing in the words of Clare herself. Karen?
Yes. Always be lovers of God and your souls and the souls of your sisters and brothers, and always be eager to observe what you have promised the Lord. May the Lord be with you always, and wherever you are, may you be with him always.
Amen.
Amen.
Thank you very much for joining with us this evening. We appreciate everything that Brother Sean and the community of Interfaith Franciscans do to help us to share these presentations with you. Once again, we want to remind you that Karen's book, Clare, Her Light and Her Song, is available at our website. And also, too, if you just simply have a reflection or want to make a response, you can get in touch with us by our email, pkfredette@frontier.com, or you can visit our website, ravensbreadministries.com, and go to the Contact Us page, and you can respond to us there. Until next week, thank you again, good evening, and God bless you.